Well, hello. I believe that we are now on. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us at Canon Press. I'm Ben Merkel. I'm here with Pastor Doug Wilson. We're here to talk about his recent book, just published, Rules for Reformers. We wanted to give you an opportunity to ask some questions to Pastor Wilson about this book. And the way this works is everyone on the webinar is muted except for us. We get to speak. Okay. To submit your questions, just type them in the question window on the right side of your screen, and then we'll grab them from there and I'll ask Pastor Wilson the questions. As you saw in the graphic on your screen when you first joined in, that we will be live tweeting this event with the hashtag RulesQA. So please join us in helping to get the word out about that. We're also offering our attendees a limited time offer to purchase Jim Wilson's two of his books, Principles of War and Strategies and Tactics, by using
Weapons and Tactics.
Weapons and Tactics. Okay. Weapons and Tactics. There we go. By using the coupon code RulesQA on CanonPress.com. You can do that between now and tomorrow night at midnight. These two books were very influential in what Pastor Wilson wrote in Rules for Reformers. So maybe we'll ask him a little bit about that as well. So let's go ahead and get this started. I'm wondering if you could just tell us first of all why you wrote the book, and maybe you could talk about the significance of your dad's two books in what you did here.
Okay. I wrote the book because the administration that we're currently under, President Obama's administration, was radically affected by the work of a community organizer in Chicago named Saul Alinsky, who wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. And he was an atheist, very hard left atheist guy, but he was very shrewd, like Joab. He really knew how to engage culturally. And he wrote this book, Rules for Radicals. When President Obama was first elected 6 years ago, I knew that there was this element in his background. So Obama had been a community organizer in Chicago, and Alinsky had been a generation or so before. Hillary Clinton also had done her thesis at, I think it was at Wellesley. She did her thesis on Alinsky's work. So Saul Alinsky was very influential in Hillary Clinton's early political formation and President Obama's. And I thought we needed a conservative Christian answer to that. Sort of a parallel. There are places where I can go parallel with what Alinsky says, yeah, that's right, and we need to do it this way. And then there are other places where we just can't play that way. So it was basically a response to variation of and response to Saul Alinsky.
Okay. And what role did your dad's books have in?
Well, one of the reasons why when I read Alinsky's book shortly after Obama was elected, I think one of the things that resonates with me in Alinsky's thinking is that he is a principled thinker. There's a difference between strategic principle and particular tactics. So in any war, it could be the weapons and the tactics might vary. Chariots would maneuver in a particular way, triremes would maneuver in a particular way, and aircraft carriers maneuver in a particular way. There are things that are connected to the tactic or the instrument or the vessel that you're using. Mm-hmm. But in the history of all warfare, the principles have been constant. Mm-hmm. Right? So Alinsky is a principled thinker. He knows what the core issues are, and he also knows that these things have to be embodied. Well, my dad wrote a book called Principles of War back in the late 60s, which took he was a Naval Academy graduate and went to the Naval War College in Monterey and graduate studies, and he took the principles of military warfare, things like mobility, surprise, concentration, objective, and he applied them to evangelism. So his book, Principles of War, is thoughts on strategic evangelism. And what I'm doing is I'm taking those same principles and applying them to cultural engagement, which is not the same as evangelism, but related to it with some overlap. Alinsky is very important because he is a good example of what happens when you have a principled thinker on the other side and you have a methodological thinker or non-thinker on our side who just knows how to plug the formula. All I know how to do is share the 4 spiritual laws, or all I know how to do is write a letter to the editor. Well, that's method. Those are methods, and methods are necessary, but we have to get to the principles underneath.
Okay. Can you tell us about the cover and what's with the Grateful Dead dude on his way to batting practice?
I'd be happy to. Are you wanting me to explain the cover? I'd be happy to explain the cover as much as I can.
Some things can't be explained.
Some things can't be explained. I know that this cover makes me look like a bad boy. I do recognize that. But that would be a mistake. That'd be a mistaken inference. The real bad boys are the creative forces here at Canon Press that made me do this, that had me do this. That's not a motorcycle jacket. That's my Genevan robe. So that's my Genevan robe that I wear at New St. Andrews Disputatio, which they photoshopped a motorcycle gang thing on the back of, and basically what this and then the baseball bat and the clay pot and the baseball bat, that relates to a music video that I just recently did with a band of guys here in Moscow, the Jenny Geddes band, who are basically the guys I work with in the studio. We put together a music video called "Hold Your Peace," and the motif is hitting clay pots with a baseball bat in the
Romans 9 thing.
The Romans 9 thing. Hold your peace, rebellious pot. The Lord is God and you are not.
Okay.
So there's a little cross-reference thing between this book and the video.
Back to just sort of the reason for the writing of this book. I'm wondering if you could explain why the need, not just, I understand the need to think principally in terms of the kind of conflicts that we get into, but I'm wondering, why do evangelicals in particular need to be exhorted this way and need to have some of this stuff spelled out for them? Because it seems like evangelicals just regularly get played.
Yes.
In our current engagement with pop culture, with everything that's going on in government, we currently get rhetorically put in the wrong position.
Right. We get pushed back on our heels, and the logic behind this cover actually plays into this. This is a bad boy cover, right? And evangelicals are not used to being okay with being the bad boy, and that's because we have gotten muddled. So we've gotten a certain thing muddled in our minds. We know, and this is right. This part is healthy. We know that every non-believer, everybody on the other side, is a potential recruit, right? So when Saul of Tarsus is persecuting the church, and Christians were hiding from him, they didn't know that this is the future author of most of the New Testament.
Right.
So we do know that any enemy of God can be overcome and made his friends. We once were enemies of God. That's all true. But when we collide with the forces of secularism, the secularists have figured this out, and they said, "You better be nice. You better be nice to me, otherwise I might not become a Christian."
Right. Okay.
Right. You've got to, and then we get, that's right. I better. And so what we find ourselves doing is we find ourselves fighting for Reformation, while simultaneously expecting our adversaries to applaud what we just did. Right? Well, if you go into battle expecting the other army to applaud what you're trying to do,
right,
you're on the wrong foot constantly. Now, God is sovereign, and He can overcome and deal with someone on the other side's conversion. But that's far more likely to happen if Christians are unapologetically Christian and are laboring to please God, not the other team.
Right.
Please God, not the devil.
Here's a question. What errors do you think we're most likely to experience by practicing the principles in this book? So if somebody applies this, what's the ditch that they could be swerving into on the other side?
Yeah, so basically, what do I have to fear from maybe an Uber disciple, someone who gets the book and says, "Yay, go"?
Yeah.
And what error would that be? I would say that probably the most common error, the most likely error, would be the one the Lord warns the disciples about when they're on their way to Jerusalem, and the Lord and his disciples are turned away from lodging in a Samaritan village, and a couple of his disciples say, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume all these people?" Well, Elijah did it in the Old Testament. May fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. So that happens in the Old Testament. They had a verse, but Jesus rebukes them and says, "You don't know what spirit you are of." There's a way of taking glee in Reformation and polemical combat and that sort of thing. There's a way of being right that's wrong.
Okay.
Right. So I would say that's the most likely error, and the people most susceptible to it would probably be 19-year-old males,
Right.
who say, "Yeah, just get me in the fight, and
Right.
and I just want to punch somebody."
So somebody who learns the rhetorical moves from here, but misses the heart of loving Jesus first.
Love God first, love Jesus first, and don't be disappointed if your arch adversary is converted.
Right.
Oh man, I was looking forward to, basically, it's the same problem you have with when someone learns that it's all right to sing imprecatory psalms. Okay, yeah, that's in the Bible, and we should sing all the psalms, but there's a way of singing those psalms with too much glee,
Right.
or the wrong kind of spirit, and Jesus rebukes that.
Okay. And tell me, how does humor play into this kind of engagement? What's the significance of maintaining a good sense of humor when you're in these kinds of fights?
Yeah, one of the best things that humor does is that it telegraphs to the other side that you flat don't care what they think of you, right? So if once you Christians have gotten past that threshold, it's amazing how liberating it is. Now, of course, we're servants of God. We're servants of Christ. We must always care what he thinks of what we're doing. But going back to my first point, too many Christians have gotten this all muddled in their mind, and they think that whatever a non-Christian thinks of us, that's equivalent to what God thinks of us. Oh, you've got a bad testimony. Well, okay, if you've got a bad testimony because you're breaking all of God's holy laws, then that's not a good thing. But if you're breaking their laws against sexism or homophobia, or all the laws and the rules that they've made up, and you do things and say things that, or make a joke that shows nothing is better than a joke to demonstrate to them that you don't give a rip about their sacred precincts.
So you see the humor as a defiance of...
Yeah.
And does that kind of humor, does that harden or soften the opposition?
Well, I think it does both, depending on how God determines to use it. The same sun can harden clay and melt wax. So one of the things that in here, I want to emphasize that we should want to fight like a cavalier and not like a thug. Right? And when we fight like gentlemen and like Christians and unapologetically, and we're having a good time serving God, that is winsome. There are people on the other side who respect that. So one of the blurbs on here is Christopher Hitchens that I debated with. I much prefer Wilson's sincerity to the vague and Python-esque writing, twitterings of the interfaith and ecumenical groups who barely respect their own traditions. He's willing to maintain very staunchly that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ and that his sacrifice redeems our state of sin. So Christopher Hitchens and I got along very well. And part of the reason we got along is that he knew that I didn't care
Right.
about I was going to articulate what I thought. He expected that from me. I expected that from him. That makes it, I think, a much better footing.
Okay. Okay, I'll read this question and maybe add a little to it. Somebody writes in to say, I'm in a leadership role at a young church plant, and our team agrees in principle that we want reformation and revival. So they're all united in that vision, but we differ on methodology. And then parenthetically he says, here's where some of the disagreement apparently is, some of them are finding your tone of writing demeaning, unhelpful in cultural engagement. So some people are put off by it. We all agree we want to have that happen, but some people are unnerved by it. How can church leaders then build unity to fight for reformation, especially when we differ in method, tone, and approach?
Well, I would say that in my experience, when I'm talking with Christians, which I've done many times, about the propriety of this kind of engagement, and I wrote another book called A Serrated Edge, devoted to showing this is a biblical approach. If someone says, I don't like what you're doing, okay, I would say, why? Almost always it's going to go one of two ways. They will say, I don't think what you're doing is biblical. I don't think that's what the Bible teaches. The response to that is, okay, let's have a Bible study. Okay, if your objection is that's not biblical, okay, let's go to the book. Let's go to the book. All right, and that's what A Serrated Edge is intended to do. There are multiple examples of polemics and sarcasm and satire and pointed jokes, and the Bible is full of this sort of stuff. So you don't want to say that when Christ picked a fight in John chapter 8, that there are many criticisms you could mount, but being unchristlike could not be one of them.
Right.
Christ did it. All right. So I'd say, okay, let's have a Bible study. The other objection, someone might say, okay, I'll grant generally that's dropped. That objection is dropped like a hot rock because I think the evidence is overwhelming that this is a biblical tactic. So that's dropped, and then people will say, well, it may be biblical. Maybe I'm not saying you're sinning by doing this, but I just think it's counterproductive. Okay, I think you're turning people off. Okay. And I say, okay, in response to that, I would say, well, okay.
But does it seem like most of the people that are getting turned off are tending to be turned off on behalf of others?
That was exactly the point I'm going to make. I've been doing this for decades. I've been involved in this sort of thing for decades. I have never once met a non-Christian who directly told me, well, I was going to, I'm mortally offended by what you're doing, and I'm not going to consider Jesus now. Right? And I stated that categorically. There may have been somebody here and there.
They're going to write in a second.
Yeah, they're going to hear from them right away. But overwhelmingly, it's Christians taking offense on behalf of their non-Christian friends, mostly hypothetical, right? Right. So, well, I'm just out there trying to minister to so and so and so and so and so, and I'm afraid that if they encounter this stuff, they're going to be turned off. They're going to be turned off. Well, what's happening there is these Christians have been catechized by the leaders of the other side to sort of run interference for them. That's what happens over and over and over again. It's Christians worried about how the non-Christians will take it.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's a third one that relates to something earlier you said, which is, I grant that these things are in Scripture, we see Jesus doing it, but it's sort of like Paul doing the allegory with Hagar, where I grant that it can be done because it's done here.
But you're not Jesus, or you're not Paul.
You're not Jesus and you're not Paul, so I don't think that your heart is right as you do this.
Okay, and so that is a standard objection. Don't try the, Jesus did it, but he was the Son of God.
Right.
Who do you think you are? Or Paul the Apostle did it, but he was a divinely inspired apostle writing Scripture. But I would say, why do we get to pick and choose what we're supposed to imitate? I grant that I'm not in an apostles' league, but that doesn't let me off the hook trying to imitate him as best as I can. If I said, I really need to love my neighbor, I need to love my neighbor from the heart. Nobody comes, well, you're not Jesus.
Right.
You're not going to do that perfectly. You're going to make a mess of it. And speaking as a pastor, I have seen many, many people make a hash of relationships and families because of what they thought love was, right?
Yeah.
So we can mess that up too. So if I am imitating God, imitating Christ, imitating the apostles, I'm doing my level best to, and if I sin or make a mistake or veer off, I should correct it and repent of it and try to get back on track. I'm supposed to be learning. I'm a disciple, and I just don't know why people say, well, yes, you can imitate all the lovey parts, all the happy parts, all the smiley face parts of the Bible. You can imitate, and that will never cause any damage. But anything that's got an edge, anything that's hard, anything that's difficult, you may not try to imitate it at all. Well, what that does is it turns the church into a bunch of squishes.
And that probably goes back to why evangelicals are in such a state with dealing with secularism.
That's absolutely right. We have taken it upon ourselves to say which parts of the Bible we're going to follow and which parts we're not.
How do these rules then differ, or are they the same when you're dealing with an institution like, say, a church or a ministry of some sort versus an individual?
Right.
So is it okay for a church to have a public face that has that bit of pointed edge, hard edge to it?
Yeah, and everybody. This is one of those. When I've taught rhetoric, one of the things I teach to my rhetoric students is that there is such a thing as rhetorical distance. Okay, so when I'm preaching to 800 people, my demeanor, my tone of voice, my stance, the way I declare things authoritatively is very, very different than when I'm trying to communicate the same truths to an individual in pastoral counseling or to a married couple, right? I don't stand on the chair and preach to them, which would be weird, right? I'm communicating the same truths, and I want to communicate the Word of God authoritatively and without apology in both instances. But there's a knob on there that you have to adjust, right? When you are dealing with an individual face to face, polemical sarcasm is almost always going to be like standing on the chair and shouting.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
When you're dealing with hundreds of people or thousands of people, or when you're dealing with the world, it doesn't have that same impact, and you've got to make the adjustments and calculate and calibrate as you go.
But I'm wondering if there's another angle to this, because if you on your blog had a post that just got somebody right in the eyes like that, that's one thing. But let's say you did the same thing speaking as senior pastor of Christ Church in a column in the newspaper. We take out a one-page thing on behalf of Christ Church, and it's one of those as well. You've got some elderly women who are saying, I'm at Christ Church and this represents me, and they're very unsettled by that. How do you play that differently?
Well, I would say I don't think there's I wouldn't play that differently when it comes to sort of a straight up the middle or high and inside proclamation.
Okay.
I would adjust according to what I talk about. So, for example, if I wrote something on global warming on my blog, I could write vigorously and polemically on my blog, but I wouldn't do that as the minister of Christ Church in a full-page ad in the newspaper, because that's not the church's message. Right. But I might, if I'm addressing some glaring moral evil, abortion or same-sex marriage or something, I might be just as vigorous and just as out there, but the subject line would be different.
Okay. How is the Westboro Baptist efforts to reform wrong? How should they be doing it?
And for those who don't know, the Westboro Baptists are the people who picket like servicemen's funerals with "God hates faggots" signs, that sort of thing. let's just assume, for the sake of discussion, assume that that the Westboro Baptists are not morally compromised. That's a big assumption. I think that they are. The strike one against them. The fundamental thing is, going back to our point about Jesus rebuking the disciples, they don't know what spirit they're of.
Mm-hmm.
That whole thing stinks. It's
they look like they'd be disappointed if the world repented.
Yeah, if it's Jonah looking at Nineveh, bitterly disappointed if they repented. So they don't know what spirit they are of, but assume that that they don't have a wrong spirit. Assume that they're not in sin, and they just have some people who are rhetorically tone deaf. Right? They have no idea how this is coming across. Mm-hmm. Well, that I would say to them what people have tried to say to me. Okay, it's true that God hates sodomy. That's true, but you don't have any idea of how this is coming across, or what you're saying and what's being heard are two completely different things. Mm-hmm. That criticism, I think, in this instance, would be accurate.
And how do you have any suggestions for what do you bring into your ministry? Let's say you get lots of accusations that you're over the line on one side, without wanting to just be steered by public opinion. You don't want to give way where you're just taking polls to plot your course. But what can you do to make sure you have in your ministry what's needed to balance it out, to show that your heart's in the right place?
Well, maybe I can answer two things at once here. One time, this wasn't a Westboro Baptist guy, but a number of years ago, one of these street preacher, open air preachers came through the University of Idaho here, and he was one of these haranguers, calling all the girls passing by, calling them all whores and that sort of thing. So he was a haranguer and trying to get attention and trying to pick a fight and that sort of thing. So he was doing his thing up there, and I heard that he was here in town. So I went up to the campus in order to heckle him. Okay. So instead of having this Christian heckled by atheists and non-believers, this guy showed up, and I went up as a pastor to heckle him. Now, I was not. He was playing rough with the people he was preaching to, and I was playing rough with him.
Do you remember any of your lines? I'd love to know what the heckling lines for that situation are like.
I don't remember any of the lines, but I do remember that my presence there was appreciated by non-Christians, non-believers, and also by Christians. Thank you for saying something about this guy. I didn't want to be represented by him, right? And by default, I was being. Well, if someone said he's in sin for speaking roughly to these people, then am I in sin for speaking roughly to him about it? Right. Right. So everything has to do with, as the wise man once said, the only difference between salad and garbage is timing. So you have to know your audience. You have to be a wordsmith. You have to know your context. You have to know your position. You have to know your limitations, and you can't rule out any particular tactic a priori. If it's in the Bible, if it's there, it should be an option.
Okay. How do you know when to shake the dust off your feet and move on? And how is that misapplied in the context of what you're discussing?
Yeah, that's another, you have to learn how to make that judgment call. Jesus says not to cast your pearls before swine. If you're in a discussion with someone, apologetic discussion, you're answering his question, and you can see that he's not listening, and he's already got his next question queued up. If he's not listening, save your breath for walking uphill.
Is there a point where you can tell that for him this is about this is somebody who's going to always be searching and never finding? It's somebody who loves just this sort of posture of being a seeker.
Yeah, it's like pastors should learn very early on not to counsel drunks. you're sweeping water, you're sweeping water uphill.
Okay.
Wait till he's sober. Talk to him then.
Okay.
And it basically, experience is going to be what tells you how do you learn how to do this. I'd say practice.
Okay. What role does classical Christian education play in working toward Reformation in our country? What are some key battlegrounds that are worth dying for?
Classical Christian education relates because what we want to do is have a generation of students who've been taught, thoroughly educated, who have grist for the mill. They've got something to say. They've been equipped. They've been trained. They're not having to relearn everything. They're not having to undo their education. They can just run with it. So that's the first part. What was the second part of the question?
What are some key battlegrounds that are worth dying on? Dying for, yeah.
I would say the key battles of our era would be same-sex marriage and abortion. We're speaking culturally.
Mm-hmm.
In the church, the culture is upstream from politics. You've got politics, culture's upstream from politics, and religion is upstream from culture. Mm-hmm. So all of these cultural things that I'm suggesting, I think we should do these things. We should be engaged. We should be faithful at our post. But we should also expect nothing to happen unless there's a massive reformation and revival in the church. So the key battleground is the restoration of true gospel preaching in the church, reformation and revival there.
Okay.
And that's going to overflow into an awareness that our land is blood-soaked because of abortion and given over to perversion because of same-sex marriage. And that's the key cultural thing. Entertainment is all around that. And then the last in the chain would be the laws, the politics of it.
If we could just look at both of those, on the homosexual agenda, the thing that constantly gets evangelicals all tied up is that they feel like the way they're maneuvered, they've gotten tricked to where they're standing for hate against the people who stand for love.
Right.
That's just somebody's pulled your shirt up over your head.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, is there one particular chapter here, is there one particular point you'd say, this is what you've got to get straight if you're going to address that faithfully?
Yeah, this goes back to not caring what they say, but you have to not care emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to have something to say in response to them saying that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when someone says, well, your agenda is just pure hate, man,
Mm-hmm.
or let's say this is television and you're the Piers Morgan or somebody, why are you supportive of hate? The first thing I would say is there is no God. We are the end product of evolution, time and chance, acting on matter. What's wrong with hate? Right? You don't borrow Christian values,
Mm-hmm.
hijack them, take them over to your worldview, and then use them on me. Right? That makes no sense at all. So if there is no God, if John Lennon's song, "Imagine There's No Heaven," there's no hell below us, above us only sky. If that's the case, certain things follow.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that follows is that hate is not a moral category. Right? So their bumper sticker says, "Hate is not a family value."
Mm-hmm.
I say, okay, what is it? You tell me. You tell me. Now, the Bible tells us, if once I say you have no right to that term at all,
Mm-hmm.
you can't talk about love, you can't talk about hate, you can't talk about any of that stuff. I can because I'm a Christian. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, it says in Proverbs. Hatred is good. Love is good. Love is bad when you're loving the world. Love is good when you're loving God. Love is good when you love your mom. Love is good when you love things that are worth loving. Hatred is good when you hate evil, when you hate an abomination, when you hate injustice. There's no vice or virtue that can be found in a transitive verb. So I love fill in the blank. Nobody knows if I'm a virtuous man or not until I supply the direct object.
Mm-hmm.
If I say I love ice cream, or I love my mom, or I love child porn, or I love the devil. Every time I switch in a new direct object, that love becomes morally outrageous or morally virtuous, or love is always affected by the direct object. The same thing is true of hatred. I hate injustice. I hate wickedness. I hate perversion of the courts. I hate I hate a bunch of things. And the fear of the Lord is to hate that way. So when I'd say, yeah, love and hate are biblical verbs, and it's sinful to love the wrong things, and it's sinful to hate the wrong things. It's virtuous to love the right things, and it's virtuous to hate the right things. And you're an evolutionist in a materialistic, nihilistic universe, and you use these arbitrary words that you've snatched out of the sky, and you throw them at me as though I'm supposed to care what you think hate is,
Okay. Go back to some of the questions we've got here. What has been your biggest criticism on this book when you had pushback from people?
Besides the cover. Actually, seriously, that was probably the biggest pushback was the cover. There's a television show called Sons of Anarchy that this is reminiscent of, a show that I've never seen, and which I understand is a vile show. And if someone says, "Well, why are you, riffing off of, why are you riffing off of that?" It's basically the move is this. It's not me trying to be a reformed evangelical son of anarchy. What it is turning the tables. So in the world of Breaking Bad and Sons of Anarchy, the world wants to be transgressive. Or they're trying to offend all our 1950s Eisenhower white bread values. That's what they're trying to do. And what we're doing is being transgressive back. Okay. All right, we're saying we are to you. Our approach to theocratic libertarianism, right, is to you what you're trying to be to sort of defenseless traditional values types.
So I want to be faithful to God's laws, but I want to break all yours.
Right. I'm your bad boy.
Yeah.
I don't want to be his, but I'm your bad boy.
How could one go about studying culture to be able to see the indicators like you do, so we can better apply these principles?
I would. There's no substitute for reading, study, watching. I would start with, quite honestly, Francis Schaeffer as one of the first foundational attempts to engage with this whole thing. How should we then live? And some of Francis Schaeffer's stuff on this was quite good and quite influential for me in getting started this way. There are a number of good books that and books on this subject are sort of a constant theme in my reading. I would say maybe a good 25% of my reading is connected to cultural evaluation, cultural histories, cultural interaction from different perspectives. Sometimes the believer perspective, sometimes from Roman Catholics, sometimes from evangelical Protestants, and I want to be very acquainted with that world. Some good Nancy Pearcey is got a really good book on it, Saving Leonardo. Hans Ruckmacher got a good book. There's just there are a host of good books. Roman Catholic writer E. Michael Jones has done some good work. A book of his called Degenerate Moderns. Paul Johnson has a book called Intellectuals. It's very good. I really need to put together a bibliography sometime on books of cultural evaluation, interaction. I've got a shelf. I've probably got 5 or 6 feet of books that I've worked through. There's no chase the footnotes. Basically, I'd say.
Yeah.
Hole in Our Soul by Martha Baylis on pop music. All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes by Ken Myers. There's a
Okay.
lot of good books.
I wanted to go back as you're describing how you would interact on the question of the homosexual agenda, hate versus love. You're describing some very careful, let's go back and define our terms and see how there's actually a trick being played here. But the problem is, it seems like whenever you get into a discussion like that, it's not a conversation, it's a chant. You're speaking to people who are just pounding the table and repeating a mantra. You're not actually interacting intellectually with anyone.
Yeah, I should. One of my favorite stories, all-time favorite stories, was one time there was a anti-homosexual marriage thing, or some homosexual ordinance on the ballot here in Idaho, probably 20 years ago now. And I was on the League of Women Voters, put together a panel discussion on this, and that meeting was rowdy. And I had a note pre-written to the moderator to call the cops that I was, that I was going to slide to him if it became, and when we got there maybe half hour early, and the room was jam-packed full. I think a bunch of homosexual activists had been flown in from New York City or something. Here we are in little Idaho, and they had signs. The place was packed out. But the best moment of the evening was when it was all over and they concluded. There was one guy who'd been heckling me during the whole thing, and he had a sign. And when it was all over, he stood up and hoiked the sign up, and the sign said, "No hate here." And with the other hand, he flipped me off. so he had one hand, he was giving me the bird, and the other hand, "No hate here." And I wish there had been smartphones at that time and cameras if I'd gotten a picture of that encapsulated the intolerance of the hard, tolerant left.
I remember when that went down because I was a college student at U of I, and there was a rally in East City Park on that Proposition 8,
Proposition
8, right, yeah. And I remember you were a speaker that I didn't attend Christchurch or anything, but I was in the crowd, and the homosexual crowd started getting the chant going, 2468, Idaho's too great for hate.
Yeah.
And they started going, and I tried to get the 1357, I like girls. It just didn't catch on. No, it didn't have that.
You need to rhyme those.
I know. We're never gonna hold the. So anyhow, but so that's the thing is it is this. It seems like if it was a conversation you could sit down and have without everybody flipping out, that you really could make a number of these things clear. But just the recent thing you did in Indiana is a really good example of that. Where, I mean, that was 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours of just pounding the table, chanting, and I think you managed to get across far more than anybody else in America is able to get across, and yet the amount of time you got to speak and put together a coherent argument could probably be reduced to 5 or 6 minutes out of those 3 hours.
And part of that's if you want to. If those who haven't heard about it, it's Sexual by Design, Bloomington, Indiana. There's footage up on YouTube that you can get to, and that's very true. There was a lot of there was a lot of ruckus where they wanted to simply shout you down. But if you understand what's going on in our culture, all of that anger that was there present that evening was a function of fatherlessness. Right? And these people are lost, they are cut adrift, they have been indoctrinated in a certain way, and they hate life. They're just, you look at them jangle while they walk, and purple hair and the whole thing. Somebody kicked me. Would somebody love me enough to tell me that I look stupid? Would someone love me enough to just speak to me? Well, there's all that anger, and a lot of the anger was not aimed at me. It was aimed at absentee fathers. These people were just lost. And part of the reason I was able to get through to them is I didn't back down. I acted like a dad. Right? And so if I act like a dad and I stand there and I don't budge and I push back, not in order to cream them, but in order to speak the word of God to them, that with the hope that they might be saved.
That don't get personally offended at what they have to say.
Yeah, and it was quite striking. And in that evening, there were 20 cops. There were a couple hundred people outside the meeting room pounding on the door. The cops whisked me out afterwards. There was all kinds of uproar there, but I had 2 or 3 secularist unbelievers apologize to me. I feel so, this is because they saw contrast, and that's what you want to do. Is don't lose your cool, and that's another place where humor, being good-natured and not taking it personally, rolling with it, is a huge advantage.
Okay. What impact would you like this book to have in the immediate future or distant future?
I would love this book to circulate extensively and over a period of time among what I would call Christian activists, pastors, Christian school board members, superintendents, pro-life activists, traditional marriage activists, anybody who's involved in the cultural engagement, Christian talk show host types. I would like Christians who are on the front lines in any way, shape, or form. Christian education, evangelism, apologetics. I would like them to use this as a way of engaging more fruitfully, more intelligently.
It does seem like when we coach leaders, when you say board members, directors, when we coach them, we think in terms of risk management. Here's how to make sure you don't fall into this lawsuit, make sure you don't make yourself vulnerable here. You're talking about inculcating, instead of a habit towards risk management, instead creating threat creation.
That's exactly right. Instead of, now I think, first, I'm not against risk management.
Right.
There's a time and a place, maybe 5% of your time.
Okay.
5% of your time should be devoted to, okay, what policies could we have in place so that we don't get sued for hiring, for dismissing a homosexual choir director or something. The risk management is the part of this, but I would much rather wake up in the morning figuring out what fires I'm going to light that they have to put out, than figuring out how I'm going to put out the fires that they light.
Right.
One of the principles of war is offensive. You can't score unless you've got the ball, except for in baseball. In baseball,
but that's just a messed up sport.
That's a different thing. So in baseball, the defense handles the ball the whole time. But in normal sports, you can't score unless you have the ball. And Christian activists need to learn what it is to go on the offense, and think it through and say, what can I do? What can we do that will have them on edge? What are they going to do next? Instead of us being constantly on edge, what are they going to do next?
Okay. This connects to that. What is our offensive, as opposed to defensive, response to cool shame?
Yeah.
Maybe you could first just define cool shame, because it seems like that's one of the things that we have to get right.
Yeah. Cool shame is the technique that makes Christians embarrassed about being in any way traditional nerdy, and the cool, the triumph of the cool. Here's another book recommendation. The Commodification of Dissent, and this is a leftist writer, Thomas Franks, and he wrote another book with cool in the title that I also read, where cool is this thing that is marketed. It's part of American mass culture now, and everybody thinks, and this is actually a key point. In the 50s, when a kid, mom and dad said, no, you're not going to that dance, the argument would come back, Mom, Dad, you've got to let me go to the dance. All the kids are going to the dance. You can't let me be different. You've got to let me be like all the other kids. Well, now, the same arguments go on about parents not wanting the kid to go to the dance, but now the kids are responding because of this mass marketing of cool. They say, you've got to let me discover myself. You've got to let me be my own individual. You've got to let me, and so you've got hundreds of thousands of kids doing the same identical thing, thinking that they are striking a huge blow for individuality, right? Well, that's the commodification of cool, right? So you have cool jeans, pre-ripped jeans. We'll rip the jeans for you and charge you extra for degraded jeans, and we drive these jeans around the country in trucks. And we decided that this is going to be the look in a New York boardroom with a big mahogany desk. All the corporate execs decided what was going to be cool this kid's junior year in Portland, Oregon, right? So that's the commodification of cool. It's and cool shaming, getting back to your question, is the policing that people do to keep the crowd controlled. So Christians who learn to resist cool shame, and the same thing is being deployed on us on things like homosexual, same-sex unions. Well, you're against people being in love. You're against, you want to, and the thing that terrifies evangelical pastors and church planters who have wanted their church to be the church of what's happening now. They want the music to be hopping. They want the cool nightclub look. They want the vibe of being cool. Well, now all right, all the positions are in, all the pieces are in place. So now let's make approval of homosexual acts an essential part of what it means to be cool. Now, what are the evangelical pastors with hipster glasses going to do now? Right? Because their whole future is invested in, adopting this cool vibe, and they went along. They were blown along by the cool shame forces when it came to glasses and blue jeans and Mickey Mouse T-shirts when you preach and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden they're, what do I do? Well, that is the cool shame, and you have to say, I need to repent of what I was doing 15 years ago.
That's when the hooks got put in.
That's when the hook got put in. That's when you started caring about the frosted tips or whatever it was they were doing about 15 years ago.
Started dressing like Vanilla Ice, and it's just been downhill ever since then.
And that's a hard thing to do. Going downhill from dressing like Vanilla Ice is a hard thing to do.
It is. It does seem like...
I ask our viewers, what would you do if I did the frosted tip thing?
Well, the next cover. It does seem like in Romans 1, when it describes the condemnation that we're all under. We know the universal condemnation of sin for Jew and Gentile, and for Gentile it comes up because their consciences both accuse and excuse.
Yeah.
So the law of God written on their heart, they know when to excuse themselves, and they also know when to accuse others. So when you make that judgment pointing your finger at someone else, you confirm your own guilt.
Right.
Your conscience is at work. And so it does seem like a huge part of this, of the homosexual agenda, and the way it has such play within the heterosexual community, is because it's sort of like realizing the truth of Romans 1, and the only way out is to just stop all accusing. So it seems like there's a sort of across the board, there are no such things as sexual rules. Right. And I'm not going to judge you when you're engaged in sodomy, and that's going to excuse me when I'm engaged in heterosexual sin, immorality.
Yeah. Whether and before you have the big invasion, you had the artillery softening you up. So no fault divorce, evangelical crummy marriages, heterosexual marriages that are not what they ought to be, internet pornography. There's all this chaos that has degraded our understanding of what marriage is actually supposed to be. And then when the final push comes, we're in no shape to defend the city center.
So you're describing that assault that's been against the church. So then what does it look like to face that sort of cool shame argument and go on the offense now and not be on the defense anymore?
Well, and this is, I don't want to come across like the key to everything is not caring, but because you want to care what God says very much, you want to be approved by Him and so forth. But no reformation has ever been accomplished to the polite golf applause of everybody watching.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody who has been of any use whatever in any reformation has had to face stiff opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And that stiff opposition includes opposition from people who are ostensibly on your side.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you're rocking the boat. You're threatening everything. You're jeopardizing everything. But we need a black swan revival. We need a revival that's just that no one would have called or anticipated beforehand. And we have to not listen to the people who are insisting that we continue to do the very things that got us into this mess.
And so, but if that is going to happen, there will be a spirit and there will be a swagger in the preachers of the gospel that will be offensive and difficult to take for the bulk of the current evangelical church.
Yes. And, of course, and I want to say this every time, there is a swagger that really is offensive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that really doesn't know what spirit it's of. There's that. But then there is the ebullient, jolly embrace of, I call it Chestertonian Calvinism, where Chesterton was a wonderful example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about in the early part of the 20th century, when he was going against all the cool kids of that era, were the people into eugenics, the George Bernard Shaws of the people before the Nazis made that whole thing obnoxious. The Margaret Sangers of the United States and the George Bernard Shaws and the people who basically the Grubers of their day, who were smarter than everybody and wanted to run your life for you. I think it was William F. Buckley said that a liberal is someone who, when you're taking a shower, reaches in and adjusts the temperature for you. That's probably a little too hot. That's a little too cold. These people are busybodies. They just can't leave ordinary people alone, and they're trying to cram their novelties on us. Well, Chesterton, when what we're up against is not new. This has been going on for at least a century, and the essential issues have been going on for many centuries. Chesterton was a wonderful example of someone who engaged. He was polemical. He was funny. But he wasn't mean. He wasn't mean-spirited, but he knew how to pop. He knew how to throw a punch, and he threw good ones, and they were above the belt. And that's what we have to learn how to do, is fight like Chesterton did.
Okay. One more question. He says no offense, so he means no offense as he says this. But what about the music video? Is that cool chasing? Are you tagging along saying me too, please?
No, and I would say basically the music video is not in any way, shape, or form a serious attempt to be cool.
Okay.
Right. Although those were my real sunglasses.
I would say
I didn't have to borrow them.
If you're really trying to make it in the Christian music scene, going for Romans 9 is not the path to the top.
The path to the top is not smashing pots with baseball bats. So basically, that whole thing was more a send up of the cool thing than it was a serious attempt to try to be that. It's like this cover here. Okay. I'm not seriously wanting to become a biker guy.
There we go. So I think we've reached the end of our hour. Thanks for viewing, and don't forget to apply some of those coupon codes. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thanks.